Is it one of these?
I think that's no, that's not it. Yeah, go. It's a different. Go down. Yeah. Press play. Yeah.
But it's not shared to here yet.
Okay.
So.
All right, so I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mariya Toneva, who just finished up a postdoc at Princeton's Neuroscience Institute and is starting a faculty position at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems. We were able to get her just before heading back to Europe. She works on sort of first looking at the brain to neuroimaging and other ways to see what's going on in the neural activity in the brain, to see how similar that, what insights we can get for that in terms of applying those to programming artificial neural networks, and then also looking back in the other direction, I think, as well, from artificial neural networks to how our understanding of those might help us understand, in particular, language processing in the brain. So I'm really happy to have her here with us.
Put this on. You can.
Let's see. Okay, let's try it.
Yeah. Is it on still?
Can you hear me better?
It's on. It just turned it on.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. Hear me?
Now it's on.
No.
Now it's on.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know if you have somewhere to put that.
Great. Some technical difficulties that are different from the ones in Zoom. Let's see. Let's get this.
Maybe if you move the mic a little bit higher,
A little bit.
your computer a little bit better.
How was it now? Better. Great. Okay. Welcome, everybody. I have to say this is the first time I'm giving an in-person talk in over 2 years. So please be patient with me. I am warning you, I'll make one joke. Please laugh, because otherwise it won't be any different from Zoom. So yeah. So thanks a lot, Peter, for the introduction. I work on language. My primary focus is coming up with computational models of how we process language in the brain. And today I'll be telling you about how we can use deep neural networks as model organisms for how we process language in the human brain. So I'll take a little bit more of a cautiously optimistic approach than Zach. Great, so it's really quite a mouthful. So I'm gonna break it down into different pieces that conveniently correspond to different parts of this talk. So, okay, it's very fast. So the first part, I'm going to tell you about some fundamental questions that we need to answer to really get a mechanistic understanding of language processing in the brain. And I'll also tell you about some open questions where a model organism can really be useful. And then the second part of the talk, I will tell you very briefly about some recent advances in deep neural network language models that have enabled this really great progress in the last few years. And then the last part of the talk is really the meat of the talk. Here I'm going to tell you about what I really mean by model organism and what I think makes a good model organism. What are the criteria that we need to meet in order for a model organism to be useful? And I will also tell you about my opinion on whether natural language processing models meet those criteria for good model organisms. And I'll ground all of that with one case study from our work on building models of supra-word meaning, or the meaning of a sentence that's beyond individual words. Great, so let's get started. So when you and I read the sentence, the trophy doesn't fit into the brown suitcase because it's too big. We've recognized the meaning of the sentence despite this ambiguous pronoun it, which may refer to the trophy or the suitcase. So in understanding how the brain is doing this aggregation over multiple words, there are some fundamental questions that we need to answer about what information is processed where and when in the brain, and how this information is aggregated together, especially when trying to understand multiple words. So neuroscientists have made some progress towards these questions. So for example, in terms of where information is processed in the brain, we know that there's a set of regions that are highly active for when people read sentences and are more active for sentences than when reading lists of non-words or made-up words. So these regions are thought to underlie language comprehension and are termed language network. So in some more recent work, what researchers have found using more naturalistic stimuli, like reading or listening to stories, they find this more bilateral activation, so both the left and the right hemisphere in these language network regions. And in terms of when this information is processed, the researchers have found that word meaning is processed between 200 and 600 milliseconds after a word is first presented. And that's understood from a contrast between activation due to words versus made-up words. And lastly, in terms of what information is processed during language processing, so researchers have posited that the semantic attributes of concrete objects or concrete concepts are stored in such a way that is distributed but yet organized. So they posit that, for example, for banana, the visual features of banana are stored in some areas that underlie the high-level sensory perception of visual properties, so in the visual regions. And such evidence for this organization is available for many different semantic attributes. For example, audition, color, shape, motion, olfaction, and taste. Great, so we see that there's some progress on these fundamental questions about what information is processed where and when in the brain, but how is this information put together, especially when trying to understand the meaning of multiple words that are connected. So on the other hand, we have these deep neural networks that, as Zach already very nicely explained, some of them are trained to process natural language. So what are these systems? So they have had very amazing progress in the last 4 or 5 years, resulting in near human performance on some language tasks. So what really are they, and how can we use them to understand more about language in the brain? Well, NLP systems are just multi-layered deep neural networks that fully specify the representation of words that I have schematically highlighted here in orange, and how they need to be combined in order to perform the task. So one task that Zach also talked about is next word prediction. So here is at every input word, the network is trying to predict what word will appear next in the sentence. So this seems like a very rudimentary, very simple objective, but it actually underlies a lot of the successes that we see from recent work because it can be done in a self-supervised way. So it can be done on a lot of data that doesn't need to be trained using human annotation. So this next word prediction is something that underlies a lot of recent neural networks for natural language processing, or NLP. So we see that we don't know yet how the brain integrates different word representations in order to produce this final meaning of the sentence. But we have this computational systems that fully represent the meaning of words, maybe not accurately, but have a representation of the meaning of words, and have a way of combining these words in order to perform a task. But a downside is that we don't know whether these NLP systems actually understand language. So this goes back to the previous talk in our discussion that I'm also going to touch on at the end of this talk. So we see that these two areas have big open questions, but they also have some complementary strengths. And regardless of how, whether the how of the NLP system is the same as the how of the brain, I really believe that the question of how is information aggregated by the brain during language comprehension is where an NLP model can be a useful model organism. So what do I really mean by a model organism? So model organisms help us study a function in the brain by allowing us to do direct interventions which cannot be done directly in humans due to ethical or practical constraints. So for example, rats are useful model organisms for studying spatial representation because of their size and their free behavior So we're able to actually measure different activity as they move around and explore the world. But why are these animals or these organisms chosen as model organisms for specific function? Well, here I'm going to argue that a good model organism for a specific function satisfies three properties. So the first one is it actually performs this function. The second one is that it provides us with an easier platform for studying this function than directly in the human brain. And the last one is that there is a way to relate this analogous function in the brain to the function in this model organism. And so I argue that satisfying these three criteria can mean that this organism is a good model organism for a specific function. And in the rest of the talk, we're going to go through these criteria and see how does an NLP model actually do on these different criteria. So I'm going to start from the bottom and go to the top because that's easiest. Great. So how can we relate representations of language in a natural language processing model to representation of language in the brain? And can we? So in some of our work, we have shown that indeed we can relate the two significantly. So the way that we do this is we have presented a whole chapter of a book to a person word by word as we measure their brain response using a brain imaging device like fMRI or MEG. And then we can extract the brain activations in specific areas in the brain where we know from previous work support language comprehension. So for example, the language network. So we can present the same text to an NLP system and extract the representations from the system at specific layers, or even look at all of the layers at once. And so now we have two representations of the same text, one from the brain and one from an NLP system. And we can ask, how are these related? Are they related? So here we can use standard machine learning techniques to evaluate the similarity between the two. So we can predict, we can learn a function that takes as input the NLP system representation of text and predicts as output the brain representation for the same text at specific locations. And this function can be parameterized in different ways. A very common parameterization is a linear function. And we've done other work as well that shows that a nonlinear function f can also lead to better alignment in some specific brain regions. But all the results I'll show you today are from assuming a linear f. So once we have learned this function from our data, we of course want to evaluate how well did we learn this, right? So we do this on held out data. So we want to predict brain data, brain recordings that we have never seen before. And so using these methods, we have shown that NLP models can significantly predict previously unseen brain recordings. So here what I'm plotting, yeah, great, the projector can show it. So here what I'm plotting is a significance map. So here I'm plotting all the locations in the brain that are well predicted by representations from an NLP system that are extracted in two places. The first place is the very shallow layer. So it's the first layers that should only encode, only encode word level information. The second place is a layer that's higher up in the network that can aggregate information from multiple words. So what we see is that these, let's see if I can point it. Yeah. So these regions that are shown here with the white outlines are ones that we know from previous work support processing of both isolated words and also of word sequences. And what we see is that these regions are also well predicted by both types of NLP representations, both the single word representations and the multi-word representations. On the other hand, we also have these regions that are shown in the pink or red outlines here. These regions support only the processing of, or mostly the processing of word sequences and not of individual words. And so these, we see that we can only predict those well using representations that combine multiple words and not single words. And we have also seen this across multiple different natural language processing models that were all state-of-the-art at the time when we did this work. So we can see that this is only one way in which we can relate the representations of language in the brain to the representations of language in an NLP model. So what my opinion is that NLP models satisfy this criteria of a good model organism. So now on to the next criteria, which is, does an NLP system actually provide an easier platform to study language comprehension than directly studying it in the human brain? And so in some of my work, we have shown that we can learn something more when looking directly at an NLP model that we would not have learned by looking directly at the brain. So we did this by doing interventions in an NLP system that aim to isolate the meaning of the whole from the meaning of the parts. So let me give you an example here. So for example, for the sentence, Mary finished the apple, the supra-word meaning, or the meaning beyond individual words, may include the concept of apple core, or the concept of eating, or another concept that is not actually part of the actual sentence. So how can we study this directly in the brain? How can we study the processing of supra-word meaning? Well, for example, what we can do is we can do controlled experiments in which we design different stimuli that vary all the words, but keep the supra-word meaning constant. And then we can look at the similarity across the brain activity and say that the similarity is due to the supra-word meaning and not to any individual words. Well, this kind of approach is limiting because it may miss other types of supra-word meaning, so we have to constrain ourselves to one specific type of supra-word meaning. So what we instead do is we take a data-driven approach in which we use a natural language processing system to build representations of the sentence using these higher layers over here. And we take a very heuristic approach of removing the individual word meaning by regressing linearly the individual word representations from the early layers. So what we have at the end is this supra-word, is this residual representation that we call the supra-word representation. And it's another research direction to really understand what is in the supra-word meaning representations, but at least we have a representation of this, and we can interpret it. Great. So once we have isolated the supra-word meaning, we can now study the different processing signatures in the brain. So we can reveal both the spatial and the temporal aspects of processing the supra-word meaning. So in this work that I'm going to tell you about, we use two types of brain imaging devices. So we use both fMRI and MEG of people reading the same text, so a whole chapter of a book. So we use these two devices for two main reasons. So the first one is that they have complementary spatial and temporal resolution. And the second one is that the brain signal that they measure is actually very different. So the fMRI signal is related to energy demands as that increase as a region becomes active, whereas the MEG activity is related to the magnetic field that's generated when a group of neurons fire together in synchrony. So the fact that these two signals are different is very well understood in neuroscience, but what's not known is whether the processes that lead to these signals is different or similar. So we wanted to investigate that. So I'm going to tell you about three different experiments that we did to localize the processing signatures of supra-word meaning in both space and time in the brain. So in the first experiment, I'll tell you about how well or where in the brain we can predict well using the supra-word meaning representation versus a full representation from the neural network that includes the representation of individual words. So using the full contextual representation from the neural network, we can predict the whole language network significantly, as well as two regions on the medial side of the brain that are known to support the semantics of words. And so this is true across subjects. So this replicates previous findings that showed that much of the brain can be predicted significantly using these representations from higher layers in the neural network. But what happens when we remove the information that's related to individual words? So when we predict the brain activity using the supra-word meaning, now we only can predict the bilateral interior and posterior temporal lobes significantly. So this suggests that the bilateral ATL and PTL are processing supra-word meaning. And we have since replicated the study in a second fMRI paradigm that was completely different. So in the one that I just told you about, the people reading a book word by word, or chapter of a book word by word. And in the second paradigm, people are watching a movie and we're predicting their brain activity as a function of the speech in the movie. So the actual text that corresponds to the speech. So in this replication, the people were watching the movie Hidden Figures, and we predicted their brain activity as a function of the speech. So what we see is that we again can predict both the bilateral ATL and PTL most significantly, and we can also predict the posterior cingulate and the IFG orbitalis as well significantly with a corrected p-value of 0.045. So here, these results replicate our findings that the ATL and the PTL bilaterally are involved in the processing of supra-word meaning. And this is very encouraging because these two data sets were collected under totally different conditions in different labs and also in different subject populations. So the reading paradigm was from people who were native English speakers, and the movie paradigm is from half of the people were French native speakers. So the movie was in English though. Great, so now that we have localized the supra-word meaning in space, we want to look at what are the temporal aspects of the processing of supra-word meaning. So we can do this by predicting the MEG sensor time points that we record as people are reading these words, the chapter word by word. So what we find is that, surprisingly, we cannot predict any sensor time point in MEG using the supra-word meaning representation that predicted large parts of the ATL and the PTL bilaterally in fMRI. And on the other hand, we can use the same contextual representation that includes the individual words and predict many sensor time points in MEG significantly across almost the entire word. So here, these results suggest that MEG recordings are very sensitive to information that's related to individual words. And to really get even deeper into this, we can predict the MEG recordings with information that is unique to these individual words. And we see that this is the information, the predictive performance is dark yellow and dark blue. And we see that they're also much more significant than the one from the supra-word meaning. So this is further evidence that the MEG recordings are sensitive to information that's unique to the individually read words and not the supra-word meaning, at least our MEG recordings. So to summarize, our main findings using fMRI were that hubs that process lexical level meaning also maintain supra-word meaning, which suggests some common mechanisms behind lexical level and compositional meaning. And then secondly, we found this very surprising thing, which is that the MEG recordings were not significantly predicted at all by the supra-word meaning, which we can discuss also offline. We have a hypothesis why this is the case. But we also find that the MEG is predicted very well by these recently read words. And it suggests that perhaps the way that we compose meaning, or the mechanisms that help us maintain composed meaning in the brain, may be different. So this hypothesis, we have not tested this, may be different from the mechanisms that lead to MEG signal, which are the synchronized self-firing. Right, okay. And then this whole difference has consequences for brain-computer interfaces. Because BCIs try to decode meaning from brain activity directly. And so having good temporal resolution for these BCIs is really important in order to actually capture the temporal signature of language. But using something like MEG may be limiting if we're not able to decode actual composed meaning from it. So in summary, this is some evidence that the maintenance and integration of composed meaning in the brain may be supported by different processes. And we're able to get there because we use this NLP model as a model organism where we're able to intervene and remove information that's related to single words and keep the information that's related to language that's above these linear dependence on the single words. And this is only one way in which we can intervene on the NLP system. So to me, NLP systems also satisfy this second characteristic of a good model organism. And now on to what I think is the hardest one to talk about. So does an NLP system actually comprehend language? So how can we even measure that? Right, we already touched on that. So there are some ways to measure comprehension. For example, we saw that an NLP system can accurately predict what word appears in a certain context. We also saw that these NLP models can perform many language tasks very well. And we also saw that NLP models can predict brain activity that they've never seen before of people comprehending language. So we have evidence that NLP models are good at all of these things, but we also know that they don't perfectly understand language. And I'll give you an example of that in this slide, but I need audience participation for it. So, right, so if I ask you the question of what broke, and we have two options, the book and the table, I want everybody to answer this by lifting their hand. So let's see. So lift your left hand if you think the book is what broke, and lift your right hand if you think the table is what broke. And keep them there. Keep your hand up. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of right hands. So that means that, keep your hand up. That means that the table is the one that broke, right? Yeah. So now if I give you a context and say, I put the heavy table on the book and it broke, do you keep your answer of the table or do you switch it to the book? What broke? We have some computers here. Okay, I'm going to say that you switch your answer to the book. So what would an NLP model do in this case? So it turns out that an NLP model actually predicts the table in both of these cases, and this presumably because NLP models learn this association between table and breaking that occurs more frequently than between books and breaking. And so this ability to reason beyond simple word associations is a real challenge for NLP systems. And so here I would say that NLP systems do not perfectly comprehend language yet, but they are improving at rapid speeds. And so this whole research direction of using NLP models as model organisms for human language processing is really enabled by the progress in the last 3 to 4 years. And when just compared to 3 years ago, today's models really build more complex linguistic meaning, and they continue to improve their alignment with the brain. And we're really at this beginning of understanding this overlap between brains and machines as information processing systems. And there are many more exciting opportunities ahead in using NLP models as useful organisms to gain more insight into human language comprehension. But I really do think that it's key to come up with better comprehension metrics, or metrics that actually tell us how and whether NLP models understand language, which will in turn lead to better NLP models as model organisms of human language processing. So I just want to give you a quick sneak peek of the kind of comprehension metrics that I'm thinking about. And so this past year, I've spent some time at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute, where I've had a really great fortune to work with experts in human memory research. And so together, we've been thinking about some new tasks that can test our long-term retention of information, which is very crucial to understanding realistic language. And so together with our collaborators at Intel and at UT Austin, we are putting together right now a data set of humans who perform these long-term memory tasks we hope it will be a large data set. And this is from people who have all read the same book. So we asked them different questions about this book. And we're really at the beginning of this data collection efforts, but I am already sympathetic to this Twitter wisdom as one is. So yeah, try out data collection, it is difficult. And so I really hope that at the end of this effort, we'll have a large human baseline for this kind of memory tasks that we can use to evaluate and improve natural language processing models even further, and hopefully create even better models or model organisms for language processing in the human brain. And so to go back to this 4 fundamental questions, I hope that the evidence that I showed today has convinced at least some of you that even though NLP models are not perfect, they do capture some qualities that make them useful model organisms for gaining more insight into human language comprehension. So thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure to have your attention, and I very much look forward to discussing all these questions as we go forward.
Thanks very much. Yeah, we got time for a couple questions before we're off the break. Let me, we'll start here. We'll make it open.
Great talk. I have a question. I have a time understanding the gesture. Why when you get a mapping between the NLP representation and the brain imaging, and say that you can relate one to the other, that can be the reason that the NLP representation is actually related to the human brain activity, because 2 things. The first, that relates to the complexity of the mapping you are learning. You mentioned linear mapping and nonlinear mapping. Obviously, any mapping is a linear function, and that kind of tell you anything about relation between outputs. And even in linear case, if you're dealing with very high resolution data, so you can easily also fit linear models, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're that some reason you can do the prediction. The other issue is obviously the brain imaging you relate to is related non-linearly to the actual information in the brain, and we know nothing about that non-linear relation. And that again makes me hard to digest that you can use this prediction ability to reason about NLP is having to do with human relation.
All great questions. We spent a lot of time worrying about this as well, of what does a similarity mean? What is a relationship? How do we measure it? And a really key part to all of this is the testing on data that we've never seen before. So learning a relationship, but then seeing how well does this hold up across various different environments and stimuli and brain imaging data that we haven't seen. So I would say, to me, that is always comforting. I know there's a lot of work that looks at correlations and doesn't actually learn a model that you can then use to predict on held out data or even in zero shot, right? So for stimuli that we've never seen before, but we can, and we do this significantly. Of course, the variance that we can explain in the signal is not 100%, and it's never going to be 100% because that's just not explainable, right? There's noise in the signal, but we can come up with estimates of the noise ceiling or the estimatable variance in a signal, and we know that we can explain about 30 to 40% of the explainable variance right now. So there is still a good bunch to go to explain. So these models are not perfect at all, but I do think that the relationships we find are indeed there because we're able to learn in a zero-shot way. We're also able to predict brain data that we've never seen before. That was your first question. The second question is also very good. So I would say a linear model is a first approximation, right? It's always going to be. So there is a lot of work on that and a debate in the field about linear versus nonlinear models. And I won't be able to settle that debate right now. But my opinion is let's use the simplest thing and see how well it does. And then if it doesn't work, then we can use something else. But I agree with you that really coming up with the most accurate model may need different kinds of relationships between different kinds of function f between the NLP representation and the brain than linear function.
Okay, we have another question here.
Thanks, very cool stuff. I took a minute to understand what the Supra-word meaning meant, and then I missed the full understanding and explanation of the Supra-word intervention. Could you just explain that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. It's very simple. So imagine a neural network with multiple layers, and what we do is we take a representation at a higher level, higher layer, and then we regress out linearly all the word level representations from the first layer. So the point here is to remove the correlations between the individual words and a representation that incorporates a nonlinear understanding of the sentence. I don't want to say understanding, representation, a nonlinear representation of the sentence. Yeah, the idea is that the only part is a nonlinear combination of the individual words. And I'm saying nonlinear because we have regressed out all the linear components.
Something like whatever's left after you get rid of what correlates to the individual words.
Yeah, and that's very important. That's very important because we use this linear mapping from the NLP representation to the brain, right? So if we had the linear dependence on the individual words and the NLP representation, then when we predict the brain activity, we can be predicting that using the individual word meaning, the Supra-word meaning, or any other information that's present in this original stimulus representation.
Why don't we take a quick, okay, well, we're running a little bit behind schedule, but I don't fast. Okay, let me get one last.
Well, we got time for one more. Last one, and we'll get some coffee.
Yeah, if I'm understanding this correctly, I'm just curious about, there's these specific brain regions that are associated with Supra-wording, and I presume there's been studies that have looked at like if there's damage in that area of the brain, like we've looked at sort of linguistic deficits that come with that. I'm wondering if, so one, you can comment on like your knowledge of that literature, because that would be interesting, but two, I'm wondering if you or if you know of anyone that's looked at like, well, can we find out which specific layers we could remove, or like we remove like subsets of neurons or something like that from a model, and see, and like the empirical questions, like, are we going to see similar empirical deficits such that you can like target where in the model is there like a representation of the Supra-word?
Great questions. So the second one is definitely a type of intervention you can do into the model. So I think that's very good. I'm not aware of work that does this specifically for brain activity, but that would be very, very interesting to do. So yeah, I think that's a great idea. I do know that there's work in the NLP literature in trying to disable certain parts of the network and in order to interpret whether this part is necessary or sufficient for different tasks. So definitely a similar approach can be applied to Supra-word meaning or any other kind of brain activity relationship. Yeah. So for the first part, yeah, also a great question. So the problem with that is there's definitely work on having people with deficits in these two regions that we find, the ATL and the PTL. And it's actually quite common because these regions, especially the ATL, are actually targeted by different forms of aphasia. So when people have problems with different kinds of, also memory, so semantic dementia, sorry. Well, so people show different deficits in terms of behavioral data. and also differences in brain activity as well. But I'm not aware of anybody who's tried to map representations from neural models that are intervene in some way to those patient level representations. Maybe that exists, but my focus is mostly on healthy subjects. So yeah, I'm not aware of that literature, but that would be very interesting to do. I think it would be a very nice way to have a more causal kind of approach. Yeah. Thanks.
We're break in about 15 minutes, relatively short break, and come back for our second talks. Grab some coffee and some refreshments outside.
Should I just leave this and you can take care of it? Thank you.
And do you have the mic on you?
Oh yeah, I do have it.
Thank you.
I feel like, thank you. I feel like the mic didn't work very well. Sorry.